And so, when we think about, gender rules and how and how this leads to performances that then can feel like real differences, because if so many people are upholding this gender rule, as it's easy to then consider like, oh, well, this is a real difference, and then you fall in the trap of one of those deceptive differences that the last chapter talked about. And a good example of this is flatulence, farting. So back when I used to use that small reader, which I kind of miss, not using in this class because I keep referencing it. They began this part of the reading with discussion of farting, flatulence, and bathroom behavior, if you will. And your book does reference this briefly in the chapter, this same data. But basically, what does the research on flatulence reveal? A lot of research reveals that there is not this dramatic gap in the amount of flatulence that men do versus what women do. What there is a big sex difference in is how men and women feel about it. And so this is a graph that talks about like the self-consciousness or lack of self-consciousness between men and women. And although it's worth noting, a lot of people are right there in the middle where they're moderately to slightly self-conscious, especially at the tails, you see this gender difference. Very few men, relatively speaking, 6%, are extremely self-conscious, while women are 3 times as much, 19%. And likewise, 20% of men are not at all self-conscious, while only about half that amount of women at 10% say that. And so, this is a good example of gender performance. There is this rule around bathroom behavior, right? Where we don't want to think about women, engaging in bathroom behavior, whether that is flatulence or whether that is actual, defecation, maybe more so than urination. But we don't have these same hangups around men, right? We allow them space to joke about it. We even set up the bathrooms in such a way that, that they aren't afforded as much privacy, especially, in terms of like urination with the urinal. And so I like using this example, and I strongly encourage you to read the accompanying article, because it really emphasizes this idea about gender being what we do versus who we are, right? It's not that women naturally, go around suppressing gas. It's not like their bodies are set up differently. And it's not like they were born to be more self-conscious, but it's oftentimes this is taught and it's passed around, and we're going to talk about policing here in a second, but in some circles it might even be policed. And then what it leads to is this in general performance, that there are, compared to men, a lot less women out there, loudly tooting and bragging about it than what you see with men. And keep in mind, of course, we're talking about differences in percentages. We're not saying that there are no women out there who don't do that. And we're not saying that all men who are out there do that. But in terms of differences, right, this is a gender rule. Women do not publicly fart, that a lot of women, and if they do, they're very apologetic and self-conscious about it. This is a rule that more women uphold. And it's not a rule necessarily that exists for men. So how do you learn the rules? Well, this is a reminder from some of your basic sociology terms, but you learn the rules of society in general through a process of socialization. You're not born knowing the rules of society, you have to learn. And so the person who is doing the learning, who's being socialized, we call that person the target of socialization. And then the people, the groups, the institutions who are doing the socializing, we call them the agents of socialization. And so gender becomes internalized fairly early on through our interactions with those around us, who are the people who are giving us the gender rules, who are giving us those messages, who are teaching them to us, who are enforcing them to us, who are role modeling them for us. And your book emphasizes that this is a lifelong process where we learn the rules. It is not what they call the injection model. And they say, the injection model is clearly wrong for at least 3 reasons. They say, first, it suggests that socialization is somehow finished by the time we're adults. That once they inject all the rules in you, that there isn't any ongoing socialization, and that's false. Second, the reason why the injection model is wrong is that it does not leave any room for the possibility that we actively consider and resist gender rules. And of course we do. You can point to examples of people resisting gender rules in your own life as well as your life around you. And then the third thing being that because it doesn't acknowledge that people resist and change gender rules, the injection model therefore can't account for cultural change. And we already noted that gender rules do change. They change across cultures, they change within cultures, they change within different contexts within cultures. So, the injection model is not the model that is correct when it comes to socialization. Instead, sociologists prefer the learning model of socialization. And that just suggests that socialization is a lifelong process of learning and relearning gendered expectations as well as how to negotiate them. Now, when you first, while it is lifelong, obviously, though, there is still a lot of interest in what we call early socialization. And early socialization begins even before a baby is born. And so this early socialization also can be called primary socialization, when you first learn the rules. And this happens before you're even born, because oftentimes your parents are engaging in what's called anticipatory socialization. They're already thinking about how they're going to uphold the gender rules with their new baby, particularly if they already know their baby's sex, right? They're decorating the room in gendered ways. They're having perhaps ill-advised gender reveal parties where they shoot off blue or pink smoke, release blue or pink balloons. They're buying clothes that's gendered, things that say daddy's little princess, mom's little tough guy. They're buying toys that are gendered, and so in this sense, they're already setting up this very gendered world, this very gendered space in some circumstances that the child is going to be born into and raised to think of as being normal and natural, when in fact it's not. It largely just reflects these room decorating and clothes buying, toy buying decisions of their parents. And so, primary socialization, it takes place at the hands of what we call your primary groups, of which, of course, family is the key primary group. It is the group that you are born into, or in some cases, adopted into, and then you are raised. All of your early socialization, most of your early socialization occurs at the hands of family. And then depending on, how maybe active your family is in other settings, that kind of shapes what your other primary groups may be. If you're the type of kid who's in daycare by the time you're in 6 months, then education in the form of your daycare is also going to be your primary group. But if you're the type of kid who doesn't go to school until, you're 5, 6 years old and heading to kindergarten, then by that point in time, you've already kind of gone through a lot of this primary socialization at the hands of just your family. Now, there is a theory that I want you to kind of know associated with this concept of primary socialization into gender, and it's Kohlberg. And it's part of his cognitive development theory. And specifically, he's focusing on, how children establish a gender identity and understand gender. And so he splits it into 3 stages. First stage happens around 2.5, 3 years. This is where children begin to acquire gender identity and identify gender. So if you know a toddler, you know that sometimes what's big at this age is, I'm a boy, she's a girl, I'm a boy, she's a girl, right? So it's that knowing what they are and trying to identify what other people are. Now, of course, at this stage, they usually are very relying on very narrow and rigid definitions of the gender rules and gender displays. And so, when my brother was a toddler, and my a family member cut off their hair, he thought that therefore that made them a boy at that point in time. Before they were a woman, but now that they had this short haircut, he would be like, oh well, she's a boy, and right, you'll notice that they'll do that, and that's because they're going with this very rigid, strict reading of gender roles. And that's because it's not until around age 5, when they reach the second stage, according to Kohlberg, that they start to understand that gender is stable or gender is permanent. And they start to understand this for themselves as well as for others, right? So it's the idea like, oh, I can wear a pink shirt and I'll still be a boy. Or like, oh, I can go outside and play in the mud with my brothers and I'm still a girl. And they start to take that into account for other people too. Like, oh, that person can cut their hair. That does not change the fact that they are a woman, right? So that gender stability and gender permanence becomes key at 5. Around age 7 is when they really start to actively work at gender constancy and consistency. They want to achieve what's called gender congruency. And that's the fact that they want their identity to align with how people consistently see and recognize them. So this is the beginning of when they truly begin to care that it's less about themselves and their identity, because at this point they know what they are, they know that it is permanent. And now it's more of making sure that their everyday decisions reflect that identity so that other people can recognize their gender identity for what it is. And so this is where children start to become big on consistently trying to follow gender rules and gender norms. And this is also the age where we start to see increases in gender policing when people don't follow those rules. Both earlier it would be like, oh, you're doing that, you must be a girl. And now it's more like, oh, you're doing that, not that you must be a girl, but like, oh, you're not being a real boy. It does kind of shift in that way. And so that is the cognitive development theory. Now, this is an activity that I often do in my class, and it is related to how you were socialized. Because if you can think about specifically, what you learned, what gender rules you learned during that primary socialization, and who you learned them from. Was it your parents? Was it play? By which I mean like toys or games or sports? Was it peers? Was it teachers in schools? Was it specific media? The TV shows and movies you may have watched, even maybe commercials, books you read. But we all kind of got these messages about gender from our kind of childhood experiences. So, just one example of how the media gives us messages is when you look at like the Disney princesses, which I don't know if they're still as huge as they were like 5-6 years ago, but at one point they were having a moment. But if you actually break down a lot of those stories, a lot of those movies, well, the stories they're based on, the old stories, are usually even worse. They're super violent. But even the new stories, the actual Disney version of the stories, very gendered. All of them up until you reach like Brave, ended with, the happily ever after being a prince. In some cases, the women themselves had very little agency. They were just waiting for someone to save them, like Snow White and Aurora from Sleeping Beauty. In some cases, they had agency, but they willingly gave it up. They gave up their own talents in order to get the guy, like the Little Mermaid. So these are like pretty troubling messages. And I give you a video you can watch and a article you can read if you want a little bit more about that. But it's also worth noting that the messages that Disney gives little boys are problematic as well. It teaches them, that in order to attract women, which should be a primary goal in their life, that they need to be rich, charming, famous, and good looking. That was the case for like almost all of the Disney princesses. Disney princes. And so that's problematic. And I give you a video if you want to a deeper dive into kind of the problematic depiction of masculinity in Disney movies. And so maybe it's not surprising that, we're generations of men and women who grew up on Disney movies, that one of our longest running reality TV shows behind Survivor is The Bachelor and the Bachelorette franchise. Because what is this if not a warped Disney princess movie come to life? Beautiful princesses largely prioritizing getting a handsome prince, and the prince himself is almost always rich and attractive in this much more narrow definition of what it means to be attractive. There haven't been short bachelors and overweight bachelors. And I mean, we're just now getting, we've had one Latino bachelor, but we're just now getting a African-American bachelor. And so, it just kind of raises, the question of, would this franchise be so popular if we hadn't have already been prepped and primed in our childhood to kind of accept this story, the story that happily ever after kind of ends with nagging a handsome prince who proposes marriage and takes you away. And that's how you have a happy life. We'll discuss a little bit more about gender socialization in adulthood when we discuss age in chapter 5. So just know that although I'm leaving this topic of gender socialization, we will come back to it later in this course.